When it comes to iconic comic book groups, there are tons of memorable ones to pick from. You have the likes of the Avengers, Justice League, Teen Titans, just to name a few, but most people's first pick, and rightly so, will be the X-Men. They've been around the longest and they've had an impact on multiple different generations because they've been around for so long and have been very slightly reinvented for each of those generations. For instance, the X-Men are my favourite comic book team out there purely because I've kind of been subjected to a lot of X-Men media throughout the years, and I've loved almost all of it. I love almost all the films, I've played a lot of the games and loved them. X-Men Evolution was one of my favourite cartoons growing up as a kid, and on top of all of that, Ultimate X-Men was literally one of the first comic books I ever read as a very young kid, and that then springboarded my love of comic books in general. However, for most fans, the defining portrayal of the X-Men will be the 90s animated series, which I did watch a little bit of as a kid, but personally I was more of a Spider-Man the animated series person. But the episodes I did watch of the X-Men series when I was young, I really liked. And a lot of it felt like they were taking the stories directly from the comics and just putting them directly onto the screen, which is always a great thing to see, and the 90s animated series really revelled in that. Which is why I was a little bit sceptical when I heard that Marvel Animations were doing a sequel series to the 90s show called X-Men 97. And keeping the animation sort of intact and in line with what the 90s one had, and pretty much picking up exactly where that show left off. And the reason I was sceptical is because, personally for me, Marvel Animations has not had the best track record so far, at least if you're just going off of What If, which is a decent show, don't get me wrong, it's definitely got better with each season, but the animation really is not the best thing about that show. Let's be honest, the main thing that works about What If is the stories that are in the show. The characters we already know and love from the MCU, and the animation is fine. It's got better, but it's nothing amazing, which is why I was a little bit skeptical going into X-Men 97. And then I watched the first couple of episodes and I was immediately blown away. And somehow the series just kept getting better. I am serious when I say that I genuinely think X-Men 97 might be one of the best singular seasons of a show I've seen in quite a long time. Like, almost everything about this show I love. It does have a few faults here and there, but for the most part this is a fantastic standalone show, but also is a loving sequel and continuation of that 90s series. The first thing I want to touch on is the animation itself, because that was the one thing I was very skeptical of, knowing Marvel Animation's back catalogue with What If. And I've got to say, X-Men 97 is visually stunning to look at. Like, it honestly feels like they've just updated and polished what already worked about the animated style of that 90s series. Thankfully, what they do is they also add a little bit of anime influence on top of that animated style that we know and love from the 90s series. And it really does add a genuinely kinetic feel to the whole show, specifically during the action sequences, which just pop off the screen in terms of how vibrant and colourful they are, but they have a certain energy to them that I've not seen in an animated show for quite some time. From episode 1 alone, you can tell that they are really making the most out of this vibrant and polished animation style that they're using, but also balancing that with making the action sequences as creative as possible, knowing what each mutant's limitations and powers are. For instance, there is a really simple but great moment during one of the fight scenes in episode 1 where Cyclops is using his laser beams to just bounce around the room and get to different positions so he has a better angle to attack the enemies from. Just simple little things like that really make each of these characters their own, and also add a little bit more flair and personality to the fight sequences. There's a fight sequence later in the season with Wolverine and Nightcrawler that is honestly fantastic and is one of my favourite fight sequences in the whole show. And there is this one moment where Wolverine attacks one of the bad guys and Nightcrawler just teleports both of them, and you get this POV from Wolverine's perspective going through the motion of teleportation. And it's, again, such a simple little thing that most people wouldn't necessarily think of, but the fact that the people behind this show have gone out of their way and gone one step further to add these little things just really gives the show its own unique personality and really makes each fight sequence stick with you just a little bit more than it would. However, it's not just the fight sequences and the animation that make this show as good as it is. There's a lot of other stuff going on that really makes this show really memorable. The main thing being the characters. They are just as iconic and lovable and memorable as they were when we left them in the 90s. And they do a lot of things with each of the characters here, and they give each character their own moment to shine. You'd think with the X-Men being as big of a group as they are, there would be some characters that would kind of get sidelined or wouldn't get that much to do, but throughout the 10 episode run, each character feels like they've had their moment to shine or their moment to breathe, and the show does a really good job of balancing that along with the stakes that keep getting more and more intense throughout the 10 episode run. There's a lot of elements at play here that make these characters work as well as they do. You of course have the brilliant character design that is from the 90s show. They've just updated it a little and made it a bit more cleaner and a bit more polished. You have the brilliant voice acting, which is flawless across the board. Like, every actor, new or returning, fits their role perfectly, and I can't imagine the voices for these characters being any different. And also the writing for these characters is genuinely spot on. The writing for the show as a whole is genuinely fantastic. I think my one minor issue with this show is that it can kind of rattle through things very quickly. There are certain storylines that this show chooses to adapt from the comics that in the comics took several issues to unravel and fully finish. Whereas in the show, it wraps up what in the comics was a fairly complicated storyline in one, sometimes two episodes. Which, on one hand, is very impressive, the fact that they can condense such a complex and bloated story from the comics into such a very tight runtime. But at the same time, by doing that, it doesn't give these stories to breathe occasionally, which means that the show goes through a lot of things very, very quickly, and you kind of need to come up for air occasionally. Like, the pace of this show is unforgiving. It will just go from one thing to another very, very quickly. I will give it its due. There are a couple of moments where it does slow down and gives you a moment to breathe when something really dramatic or emotional happens. I'll get onto that in a minute. But for the most part, the pacing of this show is relentless, and that can be to the show's detriment at times, but it's also something that could be praised, especially when it's adapting such complex narratives into a very, very, very short space of time. Now, there's probably some of you that haven't seen the show yet that are probably thinking, how can an animated X-Men show be emotional? And I didn't think that was possible either until I watched it, because it honestly took me by surprise, and a lot of other people that watched the show as well. Because when the show starts out, within the first 2 or 3 episodes, it plays it fairly safe for the most part. It feels like a genuinely faithful adaptation and reintroduction to the characters you know and love, and the show that a lot of people loved from the 90s. It feels like it's kind of ticking all the boxes in the first couple of episodes to kind of re-establish you with what you've missed and just kind of put you back in that mind frame. And in that sense, the first couple of episodes work really well for that purpose. And then you get to episode 5, where everything is just dialed up to 11 and shit just hits the fan. I won't go into detail for those of you that haven't seen the show yet. You really should, because it is brilliant. But as soon as episode 5 ended, I suddenly realised what this show was trying to do. Yes, of course it is a loving and faithful continuation of the 90s show that everyone loved as a kid. However, it's not afraid to go mature, and it's not afraid to go dark, which is one thing I absolutely love about this show. And there are hints of it in the first couple of episodes, but it really hits home in that 5th episode onwards, where it tackles a lot of things that you would not necessarily expect to see in an animated X-Men show. Themes and topics that are a little bit maturer and a little bit more darker than, say, the original series would tackle, because that was more aimed for kids, whereas this show is more aimed at the kids that grew up with that original show that are now adults. If the show wants to delve into a really dark topic, then it will delve headfirst into that subject matter. If a character is dealing with tons of trauma, then it will stay with that character and see what effects it has with them and what the outcome of that is. It's not afraid to be mature and to be dark. It still knows when to be light-hearted and colourful and full of explosions and stuff and the cool fight scenes that you want to see, but it's also not afraid to tackle the maturer things that it kind of has to tackle considering the stories that it is approaching. And because it goes for that maturer approach the further the season goes on, it genuinely makes you feel scared for these characters. Like, you don't know who's genuinely going to make it out alive by the end of the series. And I've never had that with an animated show before, especially one of this scale and this quality. Like I said at the start of the video, I've always loved the X-Men, no matter what form of media they come in. However, with the arrival of X-Men 97 and Deadpool and Wolverine coming out very, very soon, this has honestly reignited my love for the X-Men and just these characters in general. Yes, the pacing of the show can be very fast at times and can go through a lot of things very quickly, but when that is literally the only gripe I can think of for a show like this, then it must be doing something right. Most importantly, it nails the drama as well, which, considering the types of stories it's trying to tell, I'm glad it really nails that, and I'm really glad that the creators of this show really didn't hold back with what they were trying to do, because they nailed that in every single way, and I couldn't have wanted it any other way. If you've seen X-Men 97, let me know what you think about it in the comments below. I'd love to have a discussion down there about this show. I think it's fantastic and it's one of the best I've seen in a long time. Give the video a like if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Bye.